The deep hum of the station's power core echoed faintly through the corridors as Leo adjusted the grip on his datapad and moved quickly across the observation deck. Outside the transparent wall stretched the endless starfield, scattered like diamond dust over a black canvas, with the soft glow of a nearby nebula adding a subtle hue to the cold silence of space. He had always found comfort in that silence, in the steadiness of the stars. But today his mind was louder than ever, and his heart beat faster than usual, as he approached the research wing. Mira stood near a hovering tray of plant samples. Her tall, slender form wrapped in the sleek uniform of her people. Her skin held a shimmer like soft opal, and her hands moved with precise elegance as she worked with delicate tools. Her species did not smile often, nor did they waste energy on what they considered illogical gestures. Mira was brilliant and disciplined, a true representation of her kind, and Leo admired her for it, though he often wondered how she viewed humans in return. He had been watching her from afar for months, not in a way that disturbed her peace, but in quiet curiosity and growing admiration. Her fascination with plant life extended far beyond science. It felt like reverence, and it made Leo want to understand her more. He stepped forward, clearing his throat softly, and she turned slightly, her eyes flicking up for a moment before returning to her task. I heard you talking yesterday about rare flowers across the sector, he said, trying to sound casual but aware of how stiff his voice felt. Mira glanced up again, this time with the smallest tilt of her head, a gesture of acknowledgement or interest. The sundrop bloom, he continued. What is it exactly? Her fingers paused, then moved again as she spoke. It is a legend mostly, she said quietly. A plant rumored to grow only on Veltrax 9, a planet with unstable gravity and a highly hostile environment. The bloom appears once every 200 years, according to fragmented records. No one who went looking for it ever came back. Her voice remained calm, her tone unmoved, as if reciting a fact from a dry historical archive. Leo raised a brow, leaning slightly on the rail. That sounds like a challenge. Do you believe it's real? Mira gave the slightest shrug, still not looking directly at him. It is unconfirmed. There is no verifiable data, no photographic evidence, and no biological samples. My people consider it myth, a distraction from more valuable work, and yet you talk about it like it matters, he said, smiling. She stopped working, finally turning to face him properly. Her eyes were cool and sharp, and for a long second she just studied him, as if deciding whether to engage further. You humans are curious creatures, she said finally, always driven by things you cannot explain or own. You chase myths and dreams, and call it bravery. Leo chuckled lightly, folding his arms. Maybe we just like to prove the impossible wrong. Her lips curved, not in a smile, but in something close, an expression of amusement, or perhaps disbelief. If you say so, she replied, then looked down at the bloom hologram on her screen. If you want to prove something, bring me the sundrop bloom. There was no challenge in her voice, no expectation, no seriousness at all, only sarcasm gently veiled under scientific indifference. She said it like someone would mention climbing a collapsing sun or capturing a black hole with bare hands, something so absurd it carried no weight. But Leo's face did not change, and he did not laugh. Instead, he looked at her with steady eyes and nodded. All right, he said, I will. She blinked once slowly before responding. That was a joke, not to me, he said. You said it blooms once in 2 centuries, which means it might be blooming soon. If it exists, I'm going to find it, and if it doesn't, then at least I'll know for sure. You do not even know where Veltrax 9 is, she said, clearly trying to pull him back into reality. The coordinates were lost during the collapse wars, and even if you could find it, the gravity fields there would crush your ship or distort time so severely you would never return as you left. Still, he did not flinch. Then I'll just have to be clever about it, won't I? This time she laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but one of disbelief, pure and echoing slightly in the quiet lab space. Her laugh was rare and beautiful, and he listened to it like a song he would remember. You are insane, she said softly in the end. Maybe, Leo replied, But sometimes that's what it takes to find what no one else will. Later that night, while the station lights dimmed to artificial night and most inhabitants rested, Leo worked in silence inside the hangar bay. His hands moved over old maps, partially corrupted files, and deep space scans abandoned by explorers long dead. His ship was a small scout vessel barely fit for a long-range mission, but he had been modifying it for months in secret. Not for this mission exactly, but for something like it, something mad, something bold, something only a human would attempt. He studied fragments of a forgotten chart layered with rumor and error and drew connections from starlight, patterns, ancient logs, and gravity signatures. Piece by piece, the ghost of Veltrax 9 took shape, not on any official record, but inside his mind, sharpened by hope and obsession. He packed only what he needed: fuel rations, a survival suit, a containment unit for biological samples, and one small recording of Myra's laugh saved secretly from the lab's echo logs. He knew it was foolish, reckless, almost suicidal. But there was something inside him stronger than reason, something that ignited when she laughed, and something that refused to let him back down. Now, the next morning, the station woke to the alert of an unauthorized departure. A scout ship had gone dark, its beacon trailing toward the unknown edges of mapped space. Most assumed it was a glitch or a fool's flight doomed to fail. Myra stood quietly at the observation window where she had once studied stars and plants and distant systems, now watching the void where his ship had vanished. She said nothing, but a strange silence settled over her mind. Not quite emptiness, not quite worry, but a ripple she could not name. And somewhere deep in that silence, a memory echoed, her own laughter and a promise made by someone who just might be insane enough to keep it. The ship drifted into the black unknown beyond the last beacon of known space, its engines humming with a soft and desperate determination, and inside the pilot's seat, Leo sat with eyes wide open, staring into a map that barely made sense but somehow guided him like instinct, the course stitched together from myth, half-truth, and decayed data, leading him toward a planet most believed to be dead or never real in the first place. His fingers danced across the controls, adjusting trajectory as bursts of spatial interference flickered across the monitors, and every hour that passed felt like a climb deeper into a pit with no bottom. The stars began to warp around the edges of the ship, and strange pulses of radiation stroked the hull, as if the void itself were trying to test the courage of the traveler, daring to enter where no one should. Days turned into weeks, though Leo could no longer trust the time, for the instruments began to lose accuracy. The closer he came to the coordinates he had stitched together from broken files and whispered rumors, the readings showed gravity waves spiraling in strange rhythms, the kind that should not exist, and pockets of time compression that aged nearby. Debris into ash before it even touched the surface of the mysterious world now appearing on the edge of his vision. Veltrax 9 was not beautiful. It was not even a planet in the traditional sense. It was a scar in space, a world torn by ancient forces and barely holding its form. Jagged cliffs floated midair, with rivers that curved upward and mountains that hung like frozen waves suspended in impossible motion. Leo stared at it, not with fear, but with awe, for he had found the place, and now nothing would stop him from reaching the core of its secret. The landing was chaos. The ship rattled like it was being torn apart by invisible hands. The engines screamed under pressure from gravity that shifted direction every second. Leo's hands fought the controls like a beast refusing to die, and finally, with a brutal thud and a wild spin, the vessel crashed into the surface, sliding across metallic sand and stopping near a canyon that blinked in and out of visual alignment, like it was struggling to exist in this dimension. His breath came hard and fast inside the helmet, his chest bruised and his vision blurred, but he moved, checking systems one by one, sealing a breach and scanning his surroundings. The ship was broken. It had survived, and that was enough. Now he stepped out onto the surface of Veltrax 9, his boots sinking slightly into the ground that felt both solid and shifting, like walking on a dream that did not want to be held. The sky above him twisted With colors not found in any spectrum, he knew, and strange lights danced across the atmosphere like living storms. Whispers filled the air, not voices but pressure waves that tugged at the mind and tried to fill it with thoughts not your own. Leo focused, clenching his jaw as he moved forward, tracking the deepest signal, the one that pulsed with a warmth unlike the rest, a signal that came from the bloom hours. Past or maybe days, he did not know anymore. He walked through forests of stone that grew like coral, through tunnels that spun in circles and valleys where the air became liquid and each step felt like drowning. He kept moving because the thought of her face, of her laugh, of the promise he had made burned brighter than the waiter. Pain in his limbs and the doubt in his bones. He fought creatures not with weapons, but with silence, avoiding their gaze, hiding under terrain that blinked between matter and shadow. Once he fell into a hole that dropped him into a cavern glowing with bioluminescent roots and nearly cost him his oxygen pack, but he found a way out and never stopped moving toward that single pulsing signal, calling him deeper into the planet's madness. Finally, he stood at the edge of a ravine where the gravity reversed, pulling him upward, and he had to climb down by anchoring his boots and crawling like a spider along the walls, the center of this place. The heart of the storm lay within, and it pulsed with golden light that curved through the air like wind made visible. And therein, center atop a platform of black stone, hovering above nothing, rested the sundrop bloom, its petals burning with colors that could not be named, its shape simple yet powerful, like it carried the entire memory of the universe within its glow. And Leo stared at it not with triumph, but with quiet disbelief that something so delicate could exist in a place designed to destroy all things weak. He stepped forward, every bone screaming, every heartbeat louder than thunder, and reached out slowly, gently, wrapping the stem with his gloved hands and pulling it free. The light did not resist, it welcomed him, and in that moment the chaos around him paused, as if the planet itself acknowledged the promise he had come to fulfill. But there was no time for celebration. Already the air began to collapse, the platform cracked, and the gravity screamed as if the flower's removal had undone a balance that had held for centuries. Leo turned and ran, the bloom tucked safely in a containment pod on his chest. As the world behind him shattered, mountains fell upward, rivers froze in place, and space itself began to bend in furious waves. Barely made it back to the wrecked ship, crawling through debris and blood, setting the coordinates by hand, overriding systems and using emergency thrusters to lift the ship just enough to escape the dying planet behind him. The force tore through the hull, and fire raged across the console, but he did not let go. His body gave out before the ship reached hyperspace, and he collapsed in the pilot's seat, the containment pod resting against his chest. Pulsing softly like a heart still alive, he whispered one last breath before darkness took him, a name not of the flower, not of the planet, but of the reason he had come so far. Mira. And then the stars swallowed him. The ship floated in deep space like a ghost, barely holding together. Its hull cracked and scorched its systems, flickering between life and death, while its lone occupant remained unconscious, suspended in the dim red glow of emergency power. Inside the shattered cockpit, Leo lay motionless, his face pale beneath the cracked visor, his suit torn at the joints, his left arm barely responding as blood dried along the sleeve. He had wrapped it with layers of fabric and pressure sealant just to slow the bleeding, but it was clear the damage was too deep for a quick fix. The price of holding the flower during the final escape had cost him more than he expected, and yet even in pain, even in silence, the containment pod on his chest remained untouched, glowing softly with golden warmth, like the bloom inside understood what had been given to protect it. Time passed differently. Now the stars outside shifted slowly, while inside the ship the broken AI core managed to send out a single weak distress beacon, pulsing into the void, hoping some listening station would catch it. And maybe that was enough, because 3 days later, or perhaps it was 30 depending on the local distortion field, a patrol unit detected the signal and rerouted its course toward the dying ship that drifted near a red dwarf star. A crew of 3 boarded with caution, expecting to find debris or salvage or worse, and instead Found a human still breathing barely, surrounded by chaos and silence, and holding something that looked like sunlight, trapped in glass. They carried him out carefully, speaking in hushed voices, unsure of what they were touching, unsure of why their instruments kept failing around the pod, unsure of how a human had made it out of a region long declared unreachable. The medical officer checked Leo's vitals with trembling hands while another scanned the flower, which gave off readings so unique. The system simply returned a string of errors, then went dark. They moved him onto their vessel and kept the containment pod beside him, sealed and untouched, as they jumped into hyperspace, headed for the nearest advanced medical facility on Station EOS 9. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize Leo, his condition worsened by internal bleeding, muscle decay, severe radiation exposure, and time distortion that had aged his cells nearly 15 years in the span of one mission. His body barely held together, his mind slipping in and out of fevered dreams. Some nights he mumbled to himself strange words, mixed with laughter and silence. Sometimes he reached out with his good hand, calling for something or someone. Other times he simply stared at the ceiling as if trying to remember who he was before he made the promise that nearly killed him. Containment pod sat outside the recovery ward, guarded by drones and watched by researchers who dared not open it. Yet the glow inside never dimmed, and sensors detected subtle changes in the bloom structure, as if it responded to Leo's condition, reacting with soft pulses and heat shifts that mimicked heartbeat patterns. And it was that detail that brought Mira to the station. She arrived with no words, dressed in the standard field uniform of her order, her steps silent and her face calm, though the expression in her eyes told another story. She stood before the containment pod and stared at the flower for a long time as scientists whispered data to her. Numbers and theories and hypotheses, none of which made sense, and yet Myra did not listen to them, not truly, because her thoughts were elsewhere, wandering through memories of a moment when someone had said he would bring her the impossible, and she had laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief, and now the impossible stood before her, glowing without reason, defying all expectations. When she finally entered the recovery room, she found Leo resting under layers of medical fabric, his hair longer, his face marked with lines and scars that had not been there before. Machines beeped quietly around him, his arm now gone, replaced with a stabilizer unit, and his chest rising slowly with effort. She sat beside him without speaking, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the man who had walked through death just to hand her a flower. He opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a long winter, and the first thing he saw was her face. Not laughing, not distant, not unreadable, but watching him with something softer than he remembered, something unfamiliar yet comforting. He tried to speak, but his voice broke, and she reached forward, placing 2 fingers gently against his lips as if to say, "No need. You found it," she said quietly after a pause, her voice almost lost beneath the hum of the machines, and he nodded weakly, a small tired motion that said everything it needed to. He blinked slowly as if trying to speak again, and this time she let him. "Did I miss your laugh?" he whispered, and her eyes flickered slightly, as if the question touched something deeper than logic. "No," she said softly, "not this time." They sat in silence as the bloom pulsed outside behind glass, drawing more attention than any artifact in recent memory. Yet to Mira, it was not the flower that mattered anymore. It was what had been done to reach it, what had been risked, what had been lost, and what had been proven, not in words, not in theories, but in action, in pain and stubbornness, and something no one in her world truly understood: love, not as sentiment, but as force, as choice, as the reason someone survives the impossible. She leaned back, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the lines on his face, the quiet strength that still lingered in his expression. And for the first time, she did not see him as a curious human or foolish engineer. She saw him as something her people could not name yet, something they would one day study, not through microscopes or sensors, but through stories told across the stars. And perhaps one day, someone else would laugh at another promise, and another human would chase a myth and return changed, not Because they found the flower, but because they never stopped believing it was worth finding. The station was quiet. As the cycle dimmed into artificial night, the corridors held the usual mechanical hum, but there was something heavier in the air. Not just the scent of sterilized surfaces and humming tech, but the echo of something softer, something living that should not have survived this far, yet it had. And now its presence was rewriting the way people thought about life, emotion, and even reality itself. Scientists from across systems had arrived in silence, moving like ghosts through corridors, watching the containment pod that held the sundrop bloom. None of them spoke loudly in its presence. Their voices naturally softened, as if the flower commanded silence with nothing more than its gentle glow. Its petals shimmered not just with light, but with rhythm, a quiet pulse that resonated not only through machines, but through the skin and breath of those who stood too close. The flower changed temperature slightly whenever someone emotional stood near it, and it remained warmest only when Leo was present. Even unconscious, the flower responded to him more than it did to any other force around it. Myra had not left the station since the day Leo was brought in. She had spent most of her time studying the flower, not as a botanist, but as a listener. She sat near the glass barrier and watched it with calm focus, her mind turning not through logic trees, but through emotion paths, the kind she had spent years suppressing through training and cultural teaching. And now all of that seemed too small, too quiet, too hollow. When Leo began to wake fully, his body still recovering, Mira was the first person he saw. She was seated quietly near the side of his bed, her posture straight, but her eyes softer than before. She did not speak at first, allowing him to adjust his mind and senses to the moment. He turned his head slowly, and their eyes met without barriers, without confusion. Just presence. "You didn't laugh this time," he said, his voice hoarse from healing, his lips dry, and his breath shallow. "No." She replied, her voice low and clear. "I remembered the sound of it, and it didn't feel right anymore." Leo smiled faintly, though the effort pulled at his cheeks and ribs, and Mira reached out, gently taking his hand without instruction or hesitation. For a moment, they sat like that, the warmth between them more real than any data on any chart. "You almost died," she said, and he nodded slowly. "I didn't come back to impress anyone," he whispered. "I came back because a promise is not a joke, not to me, and even if I failed, I had to try." She said nothing at first, her thumb brushing the back of his hand in quiet thought. "My people see emotions as chaos," she said after a while, "something to control or contain. But you turned it into fuel, into direction, and you made it stronger than gravity, stronger than reason." Leo's eyes blinked slowly, and he murmured, "So now you believe in the flower." "I believe in you," she replied simply, and the silence that followed said more than any complex theory ever could. The next few days passed with careful steps. Leo moved with support, but he moved. The medical staff monitored his vitals and muscle regeneration, while researchers continued testing the effects of the sundrop bloom. The flower still refused to interact with anyone else the same way it responded to him, and it baffled everyone who tried to understand it from a scientific angle. It was as if the flower held memory, not just of Leo's hands, but of his purpose, of his pain, of the fire that brought it out of the chaos. Mira began to record her observations, not in sterile scientific code, but in personal reflections. She documented the way the flower tilted slightly when Leo spoke, how it pulsed in sync with his heartbeat, and how it dimmed when he was away too long. She wrote about the way her thoughts changed, the way her laughter once held dismissal but now held reverence, and how her understanding of connection had expanded beyond the Vanda limits of species and history. The news spread slowly, first among scientific circles, then through diplomatic channels, then across social media networks, as images of the sundrop bloom reached millions, and the story of the human who brought it back began to take form, not as a report, but as a legend. They called it many names, some poetic, some foolish, some sacred, and most had no idea what truly happened on Veltrax 9, but the symbol was enough: a flower blooming where nothing should grow, man surviving where death ruled, a promise fulfilled where none believed it could be. One evening, Mira and Leo walked Slowly down the quiet hallway toward the observation deck, she supported his arm while he balanced each step with care, and when they reached the glass wall that looked out into the stars, they stood in silence, Leo's eyes following the slow arc of a blue giant on the horizon. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, not as a scientist or friend, but as someone who needed the truth. "No," he said simply, "because even if I failed, even if I died, and the flower never bloomed, at least I would have known I tried for something real." She turned her gaze from the stars to him and said, "Then let me try too." From that moment on, Mira changed, not in a dramatic way, but in small details. She smiled more, not because it was expected, but because she wanted to. She started asking questions, not for data, but for meaning. She walked slower, she spoke softer, she began learning about human music and art and stories, and sometimes when she was alone, she watched the recording of Leo before he left, the one where he stood in the lab and promised to bring back the rarest flower in the galaxy. Laugh she gave then had been of disbelief, but now, when she watched it again, her smile was of awe and deep respect, not because he succeeded, but because he dared. In the quiet of the station, the flower glowed without fading, alive in ways no one could explain, and those who visited the chamber never left unchanged. And slowly the galaxy began to understand that perhaps humanity's strength was not in their technology or their weapons or their numbers, but in their ability to dream, to endure, and to love beyond logic, beyond fear, and beyond reason. Time moved on, but not like before. Something had shifted in the quiet corridors of the station, and across the larger network of the galactic community, the sundrop bloom had changed everything. Without speaking, without moving, without needing to conquer or declare anything, it had simply existed, and through its presence, a new way of thinking began to spread, soft as light, steady as breath, like a quiet fire warming frozen minds. One by one, Leo had recovered enough to walk without assistance, though his steps were slow, and his left arm remained gone, replaced by a synthetic shell that responded to his thoughts, yet lacked the warmth of skin. But he did not complain. He did not long for the past, because every step he took reminded him of why he left and why he returned. Mira often walked beside him, her posture less rigid, her voice more human. With each passing day, she no longer spoke in the clipped tones of data analysis. She now asked questions about Earth, about oceans and laughter, and books and old stories about love, not as concept, but as action. The sundrop bloom remained in its chamber, untouched and still glowing, though now it had been moved into a biodome, surrounded by both tech and nature, blending the sterile world of science with the unpredictable beauty of life. Its petals shimmered even brighter when Leo visited, and Mira noticed that it tilted ever so slightly when he approached, as if it still remembered the touch that brought it from death into light. Teams from multiple species visited the station, drawn not by force, but by wonder. They came in silence with questions that held no answers, and left with thoughts they never had before. Some tried to replicate the conditions of Veltrax 9 in simulation chambers, others studied the data from Leo's corrupted logs and flight records, yet none could explain how he had survived, or why the bloom remained alive under impossible circumstances. No report could fully translate devotion, no chart could predict the path of a human heart driven by a promise. Myra documented everything, but this time her reports were not for her academy. They were for herself and for anyone who wished to understand more than numbers. She wrote about faith, not in a religious sense, but in the raw trust one gives to the unknown when logic no longer satisfies. She wrote about the way Leo never once claimed to be special, yet proved something rare in every action. She recorded how the flower changed her, not in the skin or bone, but in the silence between thoughts, where wonder had taken root. One morning, Leo stood alone near the observation glass, the stars stretching endlessly ahead, and the bloom's glow reflected faintly on the metal floor. He watched the void, not with fear, but with a strange peace, knowing he had seen its darkest corners and returned with light. Mira approached slowly, not interrupting the silence for some moments, until she finally spoke, her voice clear and steady, yet wrapped in emotion. "You still think it was worth it?" she asked. Again, not because she doubted, but because she wanted to hear it in his voice once more. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes, and said, every bruise, every step, every scream, every failure, every second alone, all of it worth it, because when I looked at that flower, I saw the proof that even the impossible can bend for the sake of a promise. And when I brought it back and saw your face, I knew it had never been about the flower. Myra said nothing. At first, her eyes holding a glint of something fragile. Then she took a slow breath and said, when you first told me your plan, I thought it was madness. But now I wonder if maybe madness is what the galaxy needs. Maybe we have grown too cold, too structured, too afraid to believe in something that cannot be measured, and maybe humans are here to remind us that fire burns even in the vacuum of space. Leo smiled and reached out his hand, and this time Mira took it not out of curiosity, not out of study, but because she wanted to understand what it meant to choose someone, not for knowledge, not for alliance, but for truth, the raw kind that exists only when words fail and actions carry the weight. Later that week, the Council on EOS 9 released a statement, not a law, not a decree, but a message, one that would echo through systems for generations. It spoke not about borders or war or treaties, but about a single human who dared to chase beauty across death, and a single flower that bloomed, not just from soil but from sacrifice. And from that point forward, a new symbol entered the culture of many worlds, not a flag or weapon, but the image of the sundrop. Bloom, a sign of devotion, a reminder that sometimes what cannot be explained is exactly what must be protected. Years passed and the bloom never wilted, remained in its chamber, watched by visitors, studied by scholars, whispered about by children, and remembered by lovers. Mira and Leo stayed close, not as research partners, not as subjects of legend, but as people, two souls bound by something older than logic and wider than space. Sometimes they returned to the spot where she once laughed and he once promised, and they stood in silence, letting the memory speak louder than any words. And sometimes late at night, when the station lights dimmed and the halls quieted, the sundrop bloom glowed a little brighter, as if smiling in its own way, remembering the journey, the pain, the fire, and the laugh that started it. And the galaxy did not change overnight, but it did begin to feel, and that was enough, because from one promise came a story, and from one story came a bloom that never died. The end.